floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. That's some kind of lovely old pensioner Wordsworth for you. This, I don't know if that's an example of Sublime, but I think Wordsworth is kind of this, perhaps kind of a poet that we might associate with Sublime. And that's what we're talking about today, the Sublime. So with me is the usual crew of Jack and Tom.
Hello.
Hi.
And then we have a friend of the show, I think I can call him by now, Mawgan.
Hello.
Who's going to join us in this kind of philosophical investigation into the Sublime. And I think it might be good perhaps to begin with like our definitions of the Sublime. If you're kind of,
yeah,
I think Tom's got quite an interesting one. If you want to begin.
Of course. So my definitions and a lot of my research came from Longinus, quite an old dude who wrote his like treatise, on the Sublime. And so like one of the definitions put forward by him is the Sublime, wherever it occurs, consists in a certain loftiness and excellence of language. And that sounds very fluffy and woolly, and it's hard to really know what he means. And because of that, he gives us a few categories to help better define what he refers to. The first and most important source of the sublimity is the power of forming great conceptions. And then he has 5 other categorizations, those being great thoughts, strong emotions, certain figures and thoughts in speech, noble diction, and dignified word arrangement. And this is his kind of clinical way to try and sort through what we refer to as sublimity. Yeah.
Morgan, have you any thoughts?
Well, the first thing that I can't explain I can't claim myself to be any expert on Longinus, but the thought that immediately popped to my head during that explanation was about virtue ethics. So it seems to be very closely linked to these ideas of virtue, that definition of the Sublime. I have to admit that if I had to define the Sublime, I'd probably go for the one that's taught to the A-level English literature student, the one that says it's about this awe, it's about this great terror almost of facing usually a natural scene, usually the scenes that we get out of romantic poetry such as Wordsworth, and feeling that combination of awe, terror, and also beauty. That's how I would personally view the Sublime.
I think Jack's got something interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I would also kind of agree with Mog. Mog, do you do A-level RS or religious studies?
No, unfortunately not.
Oh,
not anymore anyway.
But because we learned something about someone called Rudolf Otto, and he talks about like religious experience, and his description of religious experience is a lot like the Sublime. It basically centers around like the creature consciousness, where we recognize ourselves as like just contingent creatures, and we realize that we're going to end, and that kind of terrifies us, but in like a sense that doesn't make us scared. It just makes us realize our own place. So I think that's kind of a good description of the Sublime. It isn't something that can be captured really in a pure definition, but I think when you see something sublime or experience the Sublime, because it puts like your own existence in its place basically, and kind of makes you conscious of your own like contingency.
I definitely agree with that. Yeah, you know it just when you see it. It's very almost links to that Wittgensteinian idea of art in general, that you can't put a pin in it through words, but you definitely know it when you see it, when you experience it.
Yeah, definitely. Especially like because the way Otto goes about it is because he says the creature consciousness, and I think the second half of that is the experiencing of the self as nothing, and and before that you have the shudder, and that's how he kind of like defines a religious experience. When it came to looking a lot at different philosophers like describe the Sublime, I had a brief look at Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer believes in the idea of like Schopenhauer believes humanity is in a state of restless striving towards different goals and different wants to try and achieve happiness. Now, importantly, Schopenhauer doesn't believe this happiness is attainable. And he believes any time that you achieve one of these goals, like say a new car, and sure, in the moment you think, when I get this new car, when I get this Corvette, I'll be the happiest man alive. Then you get in the car and you start driving it, and the miles count up and the tires wear down and the steering isn't as good as it used to be. And over time, all of a sudden, it's just your car, and you lose that sense of happiness. And Schopenhauer doesn't believe you are ever happy. He just believes you are distracted. But he makes one exception, or at least kind of an exception, for the sublime. He says the only time we can escape this sense of want and hunger is when we look upon beauty. And he especially points towards poetry, art, and just a great view, looking out across a landscape and witnessing nature. He thinks there's something powerful in it because it stops all of our senses. And just for a moment, we're overwhelmed by this innate sense of beauty. And just for a moment, it stops this restless striving, this continuous cycle. It's the one moment Schopenhauer thinks we can be at peace.
I think that's very interesting because it links quite well to the romantic idea, which is that it's the meeting of the subjective internal, that are emotions, and the kind of objective external, which is the kind of the sights of the natural world, and that kind of awe and reverence that you feel, and that awe and reverence in itself, and that understanding of that kind of emotion transcends kind of rational and kind of the extent of what the alphabet can convey. So also thinking about in its place in literature, which we're talking about philosophy, but kind of if we're going to bring it perhaps to literature, I think there is plenty of room for the sublime near all parts of arts. So just looking at literature, we can see kind of Wordsworth there. Probably that's not the best example. I think his Preludes are a really good example of him he took some kind of peak, doesn't he? Kind of
Big
that peak that he looks up as he's rowing the boat.
Yeah, and then there's Victor Frankenstein as he kind of finds peace walking in the mountains, and then of course there's kind of Rousseau's last work, Reveries of a Solitary Walker, or even the cowboy movies of the cowboy kind of moving into the plains of the fields as the kind of Dust Bowl rows past, all of this, and him just staring into the distance. I think it's present in all kind of aspects of art and literature, and I suppose that kind of highlights its ubiquity in life for us. I don't know what we thought about the maybe the impact between religion and the sublime, because I know that Christianity is associated with this kind of large and kind of an understanding of truths that sometimes need us to transcend kind of rationale and our normal way of thinking, and particularly even if we think of physical presentations of the divine in churches like St. Peter's Basilica or the Vatican. It's this kind of, these buildings are designed to kind of represent and evoke the kind of sublimity of God and his kind of all his might and grandeur, and almost overwhelm us in that. So I don't know if that because I know, Jack, there's a church near us that I think me and you have some kind of sublime.
Yeah, we do actually. Would it be the one that's near Lim High? Would it be that one?
Yeah, this one.
Yeah.
So I wonder what we think of that. Not just in terms of the architecture, perhaps we can move on to that later, but in the religious aspect.
Yeah, I mean, like a key aspect of God is that he's like, or a key characteristic of God, if it were to exist, would be that it would like transcend all like human knowledge. So I think to call God the sublime would perhaps be like a correct thing to like attribute it to it, and it would make sense why like architects would try and recreate the sublime in the churches to varying degrees. Of course, the church near Lim is an absolutely amazing sight in the morning on the way to school, but I wouldn't really call it sublime. It doesn't put my consciousness into question. I'm not walking along the bridleway and thinking, man, do I really exist, or do I really mean anything? But I think calling God a sublime being is like a correct terminology and like should be used. But does attributing God to the sublime enforce the sublime, or does it weaken it? Is it a way for us to like cope with the sublime, or is it a way of us like affirming the sublime? Because I know somebody who would probably say that if we just attribute like the sublime to God, that's just us like not affirming suffering, not affirming what life is. And he's a German guy with a quite an amazing mustache. So
you're on about.
I think we might get onto him later. So what do you think about religion and the sublime, Tom?
Oh, okay, passing over to me. Well, when it comes to religion and the sublime, I think it's definitely a way to interpret it. It's definitely a way to look upon like the world, because obviously, like you get when you started off looking at Rudolf Otto's understanding of like the numinous experience, the sublime, it appears as though lots of different philosophers have taken a crack at explaining this kind of scenario, this kind of sublimity, this feeling of your senses being overwhelmed, and different people come to different ideas on it. So again, for like Otto, he's gonna attribute the sublime, and he's gonna refer to it, as he does with his definition, as a religious experience. Because when Otto's talking about the numinous, he's referring to having a religious experience. And it seems as though in the Western world, a lot of the time when we're looking at this like beautiful pastoral imagery, and we're looking over at the grandiosity of the world, because we're informed by this like understanding of like Christianity and like the Abrahamic ideas, like the Abrahamic like God, and like teleology, looking at the world as like designed and its final end, because of God, it makes us link the powerful like aspect of nature with God. It's quite a Christocentric understanding of, and by Christocentric I mean Christ-centered understanding of the sublime, because it appears as though we're not inherently saying nature has this beauty in of itself. We're not saying that nature is beautiful per se. We're saying nature is beautiful because it links to God. Because if we look at, like, I think it was Saint Jaculus? Is it Saint Francis of Assisi or Assisi?
Saint
There
Francis
we go.
of Assisi, yeah.
Yeah, but he was a very prominent original like scholar of Christian stewardship. And when he looked at nature and its beauty, it was beautiful for him because of its connection to God. As Augustine says, if the entire universe is made ex nihilo, from nothing, it's entirely from God. And because of that, it appears through a Christian or religious understanding of the sublime, we ultimately attribute the beauty of the sublime to God. Or at least that's the way I'd look at it. Has anyone got any thoughts, any directions, or any ways they think about that?
Would that be a instrumentalist view of like nature, viewing it as purely a instrument of God?
Mm-hmm. Mawgan, have you got any opinions on the way religion intertwines with the sublime?
I do. I seem to think that the sublime is something possibly, especially from the perspective of the ineffable, so the God that we can't understand.
Yeah.
The sublime is possibly, I'd say, key, at least to the way that I understand my religion and the way that I interpret God. I mostly take from Moses, I'm going to have to be careful about pronunciation here, because every time I say the name, I always pronounce it differently. Moses Maimonides, who was a Jewish theologian who took the idea that God, you just can't define him. You just can't think about him. There's no way to define him. You just have to sort of bask in him, essentially. And that's a very sublime idea, this idea that you just have to watch and observe and appreciate the emotion. To bring it back to literature, though, because I think that the literary and religious and philosophical aspects can all actually intertwine. I think that I'm researching the book The Secret History for my English literature course.
Beauty is terror.
Yeah, beauty is terror. And one of the critics that actually looks at The Secret History, a guy called John Petra, he said that Tart approaches the novel in a very Catholic way, because he claims that Catholicism is obsessed with beauty and obsessed with this idea of things being, really ornate and beautiful. But I have to admit, I wouldn't describe that as sublime. I don't go into Catholic churches and I wouldn't describe them as sublime. If I'm totally honest, when I've been into Catholic churches, what I felt more is genuine terror rather than the sublime. I haven't felt that sort of combination of wow, oh, this is amazing and it's terrifying, but I've more just felt, ooh, this is a bit off. But maybe that's because I'm not Catholic myself. But I think that that's an interesting way of looking at the interaction between religion and the sublime, especially through literature, and to how as to how writers have interpreted religion and the sublime together.
I think the question of ineffability is quite true, because it rings true with how a lot of writers, particularly Rousseau, believed that it was the sublime is best expressed through music as this kind of pure form of, I suppose, as a chance to view the sublime without the needs for a kind of an alphabet or anything like this. So that's a lot of Rousseau's kind of contributions to the encyclopedia were on music for. But that was kind of a real way to express the beauty and the pureness of the sublime, because of course music is beyond words or language. I don't know if that. So I think if anything, that speaks for the kind of the wide panoramic zone that the sublime can have on all life.
Yeah, definitely. I think music is like definitely an important way, and I think over time, like I think for a lot of people, the sublimity may come like more from music than from our scenery and landscape, as in time as like it's easier to like record and capture music than it was so many hundreds of years ago. In terms of ineffability, so I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent. In terms of ineffability, I can't understand Japanese, and there's a band I really like called. There's a band I really like called the Fishmans, and they're a Japanese band, and all the lyrics are in Japanese. And because of that, when the lead singer is singing his heart out and he's going into falsetto and he's dropping it back down, I can't understand a word he's saying. And it's some of the best music I've ever listened to. It's the idea of like, I don't know I have no idea what the singer's saying. I have no idea at all what he means, but just to like, this ineffability, the lack of understanding, I think in a way allows you to appreciate the voice more as an instrument than as a conveyor of meaning. And in that regard, it doesn't have to be a conveyor of meaning. The same thing with Jay, you'll know this. Who's the French one who gets referred to as like the Blackbird? She like the like regret Rien or something along those lines. Is it anyone know what I'm about?
Oh, this isn't so. Yeah. I'm probably more familiar with classical French. I think you're going to say like Debussy or Ravel or someone.
Ooh, it's like Je no regret rien.
Je ne regrette rien.
Yeah, there we go. That's
a woman. It's a woman, isn't it? The singer, not the composer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Morgan. Again, really beautiful song. Don't know what she's going on about. To be honest.
I think it's never getting nothing charged. Just
I would like to ask you, Morgan. Did you research in terms of Longinus, however you say his name? Did you have a look at all at like his ideas of like the bombast?
No, I have to admit I didn't. Would you like to enlighten me?
I'll be happy to. So when Longinus is talking about sublime, he says a lot of people fail in their attempt at reaching sublimity or writing something or making you feel sublime. And he refers to this as the bombast. He is trying to kind of show us what the bombast is, and then via negativa explain instead what the sublime is. He says it's a kind of swelling. He refuses it. He compares it to people who like suffered from an illness I forget the name of, where it's like the swelling of the body due to increased like liquid in the body, excess liquid. He says there's like two vices, and again links that they do virtue ethics. So that puerility, childishness, which ends in frigidity, and false sentiment. He says the childishness occurs when writing is stiff and laboured, and it's written by like a boring scholarly type who wants to try and make it seem sublime. He's like throwing every poetic device and idea he can at the wall to try and make his work seem as sublime as possible. And he thinks the other issue is when people are trying to be showy without being emotional. He thinks, and now this really interests me because this second point in talking about the content of the writing as opposed to just the aestheticism of the writing is really interesting to me, because I think a lot of the times, a lot of sublime writing and a lot of writing that can have that like beautiful effect on people is writing that is flair without any content. And I don't know if that's going to be a very controversial point, but I really enjoy aestheticism in terms of the, beauty for beauty's sake. And we don't always need
to your passion for the decadence, Tom.
It does. I love my decadent writers, from Oscar Wilde to Lionel.
I think Morgan was saying with me this. You must read The Secret History, but he's putting it off until summer. He's putting it off until summer because he doesn't. Just trying to study.
No. If I'm doing my coursework on it, and I have to plough through this book, which is dying because I have to annotate it so much, it's falling apart at the ends. If I can do that, you can just read it.
I might be able to. And once I finish the Iliad, I'll make a note to pick up a copy of the Secret History and start
You can
reading.
borrow mine, Tom. It's been lent to 3 people already. Just me kind of screaming at people, throwing in the book. I was wondering, perhaps we could talk a bit about Edmund Burke, who is another friend of the show. I think he appeared on our Conservative podcast, and he returns again in a completely different sphere in his wonderful work, which I really wanted to buy a copy of, but alas, seldom was there any copies of A Philosophical Inquiry into the Beauty of Origin of Our Ideas on the Sublime and the Beautiful in Waterstones. So that really annoyed me. But I found a copy online and I did a reading, and he gives this definition that begins it. And Burke's work, published in 1756, is the kind of I don't want to say foundations, because I guess Longinus laid the foundations of what we view as the sublime, but I think he really kind of cemented it into kind of Enlightenment culture. I don't know if you'd class him as that, but so he says, the passion caused by the great and sublime in nature is astonishment, and astonishment is a state of the soul in which all its motions are suspended with some degree of horror. In this case, the mind is so entirely filled with its object that it cannot entertain any other. I think that's really interesting, that that definition of the sublime, I think, captures it quite easily. It is this kind of emotion that it is able to excite ideas of pain and terror and fear into, and kind of transform it into passion. So I suppose if you want to kind of class it kind of methodically, it is passion caused by terror, and then the terror, I would argue, and Burke might argue, if I dare venture so far, is caused by its obscurity. And I suppose if you think of danger, as soon as we gain any attempt on what we understand as, oh look, there's a snake in the grass, don't worry, that snake is harmless, oh, my terror is gone. So in that obscurity of, we don't know what this snake is, we don't know what it's capable of, that's where the terror comes, in this kind of, so he would argue that the obscurity enacts the terror, and in turn the terror acts the passion, therefore the sublime. I don't know what we'd think of that little progress step. I have some quizzical glances from Tom.
Oh, only in vagueness. I'm still trying to process entirely what he's referring to there. I just take issue with any definition of the sublime, even in Sacred Longinus's or Burke's, because it seems to me, if you want to be able to define something, then if I have a definition of a triangle, right? You know, it's got 3 sides. The rest. I don't even know the triangle. So, triangle.
Sorry, it's made me think about how it's created, not how it's defined.
Right, but if I was to have a I know how okay, if you just let me do this triangle analogy for just 2 seconds. If I know how a triangle is created, I line up 3 sides and I connect them with their vertices. Then, if someone had told me that and wrote that down in the same way Burke here talks about passion, called fear and passion, then I can then go draw a triangle. But I don't think, from what Burke's given us, I could now induce you all into the sublime. I don't think, because it seems that the sublime is so ultimately subjective that it kind of is one of these really wishy-washy kind of ideas. Because what might be sublime for someone is going to be maybe entirely grotesque. If we're gonna, if I just a little link to our next episode is going to be on.
That will be out next week.
It definitely will. For example, Longinus gives an example of the sublime. He looks at Sappho's ode to jealousy, and if no one objects, I'm just going to quickly read out Sappho's ode to jealousy.
Well, I think this is a nice link to literature, so yeah, do carry on. So
the poem goes, and I won't be too dramatic because it's
Please, Tom, be dramatic.
I'll water it down. I don't want to cause anyone to enter the sublime whilst listening to the.
I mind, Tom. I can't promise I won't.
I think that man is like a god who faces you and sits by you and listens to your gentle words and to your silver laughter. But my heart explodes within my breast. One timid glance and all my voice is gone. My tongue breaks and a subtle flame races below my flesh. My eyes refuse their sight. My hearing is a gong. Cold sweat clings to me and I shake. From head to toe, my skin, the colour of grass. I am about to die, I think, but all must be endured. After reading that out, did any of you instantly lose your sense of self and become?
I've got a question here that links quite well to what you're thinking. Burke suggests that sublime can only be felt alone, and it can't be searched as a group. It's a solitary idea that you can't feel. Solitary walker, I wander lonely as a cloud. They're all done alone. Frankenstein walks alone in the hills.
Oh no, I find that interesting, because if we want to link the sublime back to religious experience, a lot of the time religious experience happens en masse, and people talk about an experience of it as like a large collective of people, say like in mass or in church. So does this show?
Do you have any pressing ideas on this idea of solitary nature of sublime, and it can only be felt as alone?
I think what I'd like to talk about is religion here, and if it's an en masse experience, then yeah, it can't really be sublime. Because I was trying to think, because I attend Quaker meetings, right? And is that sublime? Is it sublime when someone thinks? I'm never really too sure whether they actually do. When someone thinks that they're talking to God, that they're, speaking God's word, is that actually that they've experienced sublime? I was trying to think back to that, but I'm not really sure whether the sublime can be experienced in a group or alone or not. And I'm sort of trying to toy with the idea as well of to what extent is it a well, of course it's a psychological response, but to what extent it can be described as a very personalized psychological response as a result of almost the neural programming within us, because presumably we'll all have different definitions of the sublime. And I suppose in that sense, it is an individual experience because of the differences in just the neural programming, and therefore just the minutiae between us that make our definitions of it different.
But yeah, that is interesting. Because I suppose if we were to look, we have quite a romantic and decadent view of the sublime at the moment. I wonder if we could switch to how an enlightened scientist might view the sublime, kind of how he rationally observes the natural world, kind of isolating and shutting off his emotions from.
I was talking about a quite a small person, a small, quite strange
German
person
who finds himself in him.
Before that, I'd like to answer the question whether the sublime could be experienced in a group, and I would say by my definition it can't be, because the sublime you start to experience yourself as nothing, but if you're part of as a group, part of a rabble, you can kind of shirk off that effect. You can look to your fellow man and just ignore all this this void that is questioning your existence. You can falsely assert your certainty onto the people around you. So you can't fully experience the sublime in a group. So I think it is a personal experience. What?
Could I interject?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just one small thing, and I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, okay, just quickly, if we're talking about the sublime and we're talking about it, and you're just singular person, a lot of love poetry seems to tap into the sublime. From what I've read, are two people in embrace and love both experiencing the sublime simultaneously?
Could you give an example to just clear it up for me?
As in, if you had
example of love.
Two brothers embraced, enjoying each other's company, and you have that moment of lack of lucidity, where they become creature consciousness, the rest of it. For a moment, are they both experiencing the sublime together?
Well, surely it's a personal thing, isn't it? So we don't know.
Yeah. Because again, because if we look at any definitions of the sublime we look at, it seems to always be it's centered inside your head, but just because it's an isolated experience doesn't mean that it can't happen en masse, possibly.
Yeah, I think maybe two people might be able to experience it, but two so I think a large group can't experience it because they can just turn to each other and assert their own meaning onto each other. However, two lovers could possibly see themselves as one, so hence they could probably experience the sublime together. And I would also challenge your assertion that like or reductionist assertion that we can never truly name the sublime, because whilst it is fairly ineffable, we can't just leave it there. We can't just turn away from it. We have to at least provide some framework and some way to talk about it, because we, like, most of us have experienced some feeling of sublime through literature. So like we can't just say, oh, it can't be defined. We have to find some framework for it. So I think the works of Burke and like pretty much every philosopher who's talked about it there was a point behind it. It wasn't for nothing. Now on to Kant, because actually quite interesting. A lot of you mentioned that the sublime seemed to transcend rationality. Now Kant divides the sublime into two kind of modes. One's the mathematical sublime. So you look up into the stars. Civilization doesn't exist yet, so you see all these stars up there. You see millions on millions and millions of stars, and your senses are overwhelmed. You physically cannot understand or possibly imagine everything that's going on out there. Kant would say this is the mathematical sublime because it's like infinity. You can't observe infinity, but your rationality can assign infinity, or your rationality can assign infinity to infinity. Your rationality can say, oh, there's 1 million stars in the sky, that's okay. Now Kant uses this to as kind of like a critique to Hume. Hume said earlier that if morals are entirely passion based and that rationality doesn't really have anything to do with it, how can we be morally accountable? And Kant, in most of his works, tries to assert that rationality is superior to pure empiricism and the senses. Kant uses the sublime as a justification to why rationality is better, because he argues that in sublime experiences, the senses are overwhelmed, but reason, or your reason and your rationality, always is ahead. So when you see a massive ocean, it's thousands of kilometers wide. You can't possibly think or imagine it, but your rationality can say this sea is 1,000 kilometers wide. Your rationality can overcome it. Now Kant also says that there's something called the dynamic sublime, and that's when nature could destroy you at any moment, right? So if you're in the sea on a ship and there's a massive storm, think of The Perfect Storm, right? Have any of you watched that movie?
No.
Okay,
No,
right.
sorry.
So it's about these fishers, and in the end, the captain sees this massive ass wave, and I think he feels kind of happy, or kind of happy in a sublime way. Now Kant would say this is because whilst nature could kill us at any moment, it can't reason like we can. Hence, we feel sublime as we kind of assert ourselves over nature, despite being inferior in some ways. So he argues that the sublime is just evidence as to why rationality is better than senses. Go ahead, Jay.
I just that idea of kind of waves is very interesting, because there's this fantastic painter, Turner. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. Pretty famous. Yeah. And he paints these massive portraits of these kind of storms and these boats smashing everywhere and kind of waves. And you always see them kind of some kind of celebrity university challenge, because they always make the questions easier on celebrity university challenge, and they go, who painted this? And it'll Turner, and then you get it right. And otherwise it's Gerhard Richter or these really obscure German artists. But yeah, so I think he and in terms of painting, I think that's a very interesting tangent, is looking at these kind of massive, as you say, kind of mathematically almost kind of infinite and massive size and grandeur. And Jack and I on Friday we're talking a bit about, I don't know if you're familiar with Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, which is this another massive painting. And there's a study that I was reading which is looking at a Kantian interpretation of that, and in this kind of inconceivable triptych scene of these. So there's the fall of man on the first panel, which must be kind of absolutely massive, and then the middle panel is it kind of utopia, Jack?
I think there's a few interpretations where it's this is the world after the fall. It wouldn't be after the fall, but it'd be a world that was deceived by the Antichrist, because there's a bit of an argument on the first panel whether that's the fall of man, or like man, or whether that's before the fall of man, or whether that's Adam and Eve accepting the Antichrist, because the godlike figure isn't really painted as God would be painted. So that brings discourse to the middle panel, where it's like, is this kind of like the start of sin, or is this a utopia if like man followed God? And then the final part of the painting is kind of obvious. That's man suffering like eternal damnation. So
yes, I think what we see there is like this massive. I'm sorry for everyone at home who can't see this, but it's that kind of, if everyone can see that.
Oh yes.
So we have kind of the fall of man in the Garden of Eden with the hole there and the Antichrist, utopia, and then on this side, I don't know if you can see that because this is in the way. You have kind of hell and purgatory.
You can click on the image to make it bigger. Yeah,
it doesn't need more to load for me.
Oh,
but there's a nice little. It's a very odd painting. I'm really sorry. Actually, people at home, make a quick trip to our Instagram and you can see it there. Well, I'll get it posted for you.
It'll be linked in the description if you're watching this on YouTube.
Along for some lovely Turner paintings as well. And also, whilst we're here, in this little artistic interlude, we can look at the painter of the Sublime, which is a chap called Caspar David Friedrich.
If you've ever played Minecraft,
he painted people.
He painted people
looking at.
Sorry, Jay. If you've ever played Minecraft, the really low poly image of that dude standing on like the hill, that's from this dude.
Yeah, so this is he paints pictures of people looking at the Sublime. So our Instagram, I used a portrait by Caspar David Friedrich. So I'll put this one on. This is lovely. And I think this is really a unique way of looking at it, isn't it? Is having actual artistic representation of people viewing the Sublime, because I suppose we see it as an internalized thing within us, and to have someone paint us looking at it, I think it's something else.
Yeah,
because we can imagine, I suppose, to an extent, what this guy's feeling, and they always associate him with Nietzsche, don't they? He's always at the front of the spokesman.
Because Nietzsche says that through the Sublime, the Übermensch will look at the Sublime and they won't be scared. They will assert themselves in their like meaning of nothing, basically. So these paintings seem to be an entirely different definition, where it's someone looking at the Sublime, accepting it, and overcoming it instead of being scared. And I think we've run out of time for this session, so we'll have a break.
Excellent, right, Jack. I was just going to. We'll meet back after the break for a short bit, and then we'll look about the grotesque. But you won't see that until next week. I don't know why I said that. Goodbye.
Hello. Very nice to have you all back listening. We're back from our break, and we're going to carry on discussing the Sublime. So, does anyone have any opening thoughts back from the break? What they thought of?
I think we really put you in a corner there. I blame Jack.
So we
you really put me on the spot. If that opening doesn't go on well, then I'm blaming the rest of you.
So we kind of ended on. Are you talking to me, Tom, or like someone behind the camera?
So you're there.
What? So we ended on Kant and how Kant kind of viewed that rationality, or the Sublime affirmed that rationality was better than the senses. What do you think of that statement? Because that's quite a bold statement. Earlier we were saying that the Sublime kind of transcends rationality. Do you think that the Sublime does in fact reinforce reason, or that it just completely overpowers it still?
I like the idea. Sorry, am I interrupting someone?
Oh no, sorry. I was asking it as an open question. If you've already if you've formed something, go for it, because I haven't.
All right. I like the idea of the Sublime reinforcing reason, but I'm just not convinced by it. I think that the Sublime is highly emotional, and rather than us switching to reason because of the way our emotions respond. I think that the sheer emotionality of it, if emotionality is even a word, sort of overthrows reason. In the very Platonic sense that, if you have too much art, then you feed too much into your emotions and then your reason just goes haywire. I think the Sublime just does the same thing in a singular moment, pretty much.
Somebody else have any takes on it? Because a key critiquer of Kant's view on the Sublime was Friedrich Nietzsche, and he basically said that
such a random guy from Germany, Friedrich Nietzsche.
Just a random guy with a big old mustache, a very dashing mustache, might I add. But he argued that, by looking at the Sublime and kind of attributing rationality to it, Kant is just shirking the horror of the Sublime. He isn't fully accepting the. Nietzsche argued that the Sublime didn't show that reason overcame empiricism. He believed that it showed the world had no meaning. You really didn't exist. You really have no meaning. You have no objective meaning in life, And he saw that Kant's, by Kant kind of retreating into reason after the experience was him being not being the Overman or the Übermensch, and that he wasn't really fully accepting and affirming the lack of purpose in the world. So Nietzsche says that by Kant basically retreating to rationality, he doesn't really fully take on the Sublime. He kind of ignores it. He sticks a label. He sticks it in a bow tie and says, "This enforces rationality. That's that," and kind of tosses it to the back of his mind and tries not to think about it. But Nietzsche says that in order to find purpose in the world, we need to, look at the void. We need to stare at the void. We need to affirm that the world has no meaning, but we can still kind of make meaning ourselves. I don't want to sound absurdist because he wasn't absurdist, but he kind of was. But he said that Kant made a huge folly in that he wasn't fully affirming this tragedy of the world, and he tried to shirk it away. So who's right here? Does the Sublime hold a meaning of the world? Does it hold a enlightenment? Do you feel enlightened, or does it just affirm that the world really means nothing?
Ooh, that's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because the two diametrically opposed views, or at least they appear at first glance to be diametrically opposed. Maybe we don't want to say, but it appears to me when it comes to Sublime, all it seems to really affirm in expressing this vastness of everything around you is your own smallness in comparison. It seems to be that in the Sublime, as Burke said, the fear from the passion, it appears that when it comes to what it means to experience it, ultimately, I think your rationality has to shut down to the experience of Sublime. I think when you're in that moment of sublimity, as Schopenhauer says, everything else is overwhelmed. And while Schopenhauer says your senses are overwhelmed, from the way in which he words this and the way in which he believes the senses to inform reason, I think we can really easily infer that Schopenhauer would also agree that your reason shuts down as well when it comes to sublimity. I think that this links quite. Jack, William James, another scholar on religious experience.
Yeah, is that the pint guy?
Yeah, he uses the acronym PINT to describe religious experience. That's standing for passive, ineffable, noetic, and transient. They're the important parts of religious experience. And just before we're talking about ineffability, and when it comes to ineffability, that seems to me to be opposed to rationality in any sense, because if you can't understand something, how can we say that it's engaged your rationality at all? If it's entirely above and beyond you, if it's transient, it's such a fleeting moment. If it's passive, you're completely you're not engaged in the Sublime. The Sublime is moving itself on you whilst you just stand there completely unable to do anything about it. And however, I suppose you can make the argument that with noetic, the passing on of knowledge, even if you can't understand it, could say that you're engaging your reason. But it appears to be that through what we see the sublime as, Kant's definition seems to be describing something else. It doesn't seem to be akin to the sublime as described either through religious experience or through Longinus or through Schopenhauer or through any of these other thinkers, because he seems to maybe misinterpret what people say this is sublime, or maybe he was just so hell-bent on trying to disprove Hume. Because a little tangent, when it comes to Kant disproving Humean theory of motivation, one of his main ways of doing this is saying that what he says, beliefs motivate on their own, like the motive of duty. He thinks that, because just quickly, Hume thinks that a belief and a desire are necessary for you to perform any action, and he thinks that your beliefs and desires are all like, from your head, from your wants, and you can't control them, and he thinks that the duty of reason is to get your passions. So Kant tries to disprove this by saying, well, actually, just a belief can do it. But by doing this, it seems that all he does is redefine belief. And I think he might be doing the same thing for the sublime. He's just redefining something, changing our understanding of it to fit his model as it stands. I don't know. Has anyone else got any opinions on this rational versus irrational look at experience and sublime?
Yeah, I mean, I also got that when I was reading up on Kant's Sublime. However, an explanation of it could be that he wasn't trying to continue on in a chain of followers or in a chain of philosophers. He was trying to explain what he experienced, which could explain why there's no set definition for the sublime, because there's so many philosophers which experience the sublime in so many different ways, all contributing and using the same word. Because that could definitely be confusing. Jay, do you have anything to add? I
thought I could move on away from this kind of intellectual sphere to 1960s hippies.
Oh, that's fun.
So 1960s drug and hippie culture was apparently, I suppose you could argue, was directly inspired by 18th century decadence and romanticism, and in that it's close linked to sublime. As friend of the show, Aldous Huxley might know, a great man who on his deathbed asked for, I think it was something like 10 grams of LSD before he died, just to make himself very exciting. The LSD was supposed to expand one's cosmic consciousness. And I suppose that's a very interesting way of opening up the floor to what Coleridge and Romantic poets might describe. So I suppose, and also moving on, we can kind of see how these ideas of kind of sublime and decadence can be inspired by maybe kind of Greco-Roman ideas, and also linking quite well to the secret history, bacchanals, and these kind of outlandish displays of kind of lust and sex. You seem to be eager, Morgan.
Well, as an avid fan of Donna Tartt's work, this is part of the reason why I reject Kant's definition of the sublime, because I think that the sublime, as it's actually, as it exists in literature, and I think that philosophy needs to take so much more from literature than it currently does. I think that the sublime is more a rejection of rationality, or it's just rationality being pushed out of the window a lot of the time. We have to remember where the Romantics came from. They came from a position of saying, well, some Enlightenment ideas are good, but they're not good for the reason that they're built on reason. They're good on the basis that they, sort of empower the human spirit and human emotion. And the Bacchanal in the Secret History, and a lot of what goes on within the Secret History, which, if you haven't read it, is about 6 students who murder their friend, and that is because this friend found out about about them murdering a farmer during a Bacchanal. And of course, if you don't know what a Bacchanal is, Jay's just explained it, but there's so much in the novel which is about going beyond reason and going beyond the ideas of logical philosophy. Even in Julian's classroom, where they discuss philosophy, they talk about beauty being terror, and not really from a philosophical perspective of let's logically work through this and see how beauty could equate to terror, but instead they read poetry, and they talk about how, this is one of my favourite lines, when Camilla reads when Camilla reads a bit of poetry, and they talk about how her voice tolls like a bell. It's in The Secret History, this sublime is definitely not about reason. It's about this abject rejection of reason, and it's also about that in Romanticism. Possibly why The Secret History is sometimes called neo-romantic.
Oh, that's very interesting. I think that's a nice way to look at it. I think I'd agree that it's kind of this like aesthetic understanding as well. I think Romanticism definitely does go hand in hand with sublime. I'd say that first of all that I need to read The Secret History, but second of all that the sublime really does seem to be a rejection of reason and rationale, and embracing this kind of like, you know, pleasure and passion and, you know, pain and fear, and anything that doesn't need to be like rationally backed up from a rational basis. It seems to be that the sublime is like incredibly subjective, and the way that we experience the sublime, it comes through so many different like our cultural lens, and it comes through so many different like depending on our worldview and the way we understand the world, that all these studies into the sublime seem so different, and each individual philosopher seems to have their own take on it, because the sublime is entirely subjective, and it seems to be entirely subjective. So Jay, you just brought up the hippies a moment ago and LSD. Yes. If I was to inject myself with let's say like 50 horse tranquilizers and ketamine was racing through my body, am I experiencing the sublime? Yes or no?
Well, I suppose, Tom, you do it every Saturday. So how are we meant to? Exactly. How are we meant to know? I don't know if you're experiencing the sublime, but you do.
Yeah.
Survive, that is. But I think that is kind of chemically allowing us to have a artificial, perhaps, kind of look at sublime. Because I suppose it is the fact that is it possible to have an artificial creation? I don't know.
Because of drug use, ketamine, anything like that, you've got dopamine or serotonin being introduced into the brain. I'm not a neuroscientist, but from my understanding, you've got your synapses, and electrical signals are turned into chemical signals, and when the chemical signals in between the two synapses, they get uptaken by the serotonin. Not inhibitors.
I still argue that it's like so massive that it would transcend any of that, but that's just ridiculous, isn't it? It's not like it can all of a sudden make you sober. Yeah.
Would it be artificial, like to take drugs to experience the sublime, or is that just another aspect of experience in the same way of reading poetry or looking upon a mountain? Are these one and the same? If I type out on my arm, get the spoon, get some heroin, put it in, is that the same as me looking upon a mountain or reading the Prelude? Because I'm venturing to say it is in a hedonistic point of view, and I'm interested what everyone else thinks. Jack, do you think it's the same?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can experience the sublime through use of such substances you mentioned. I've heard from a friend that the thing beginning with K can make you kind of disassociate with yourself in like high enough doses, so it could even be more powerful than like natural sublime, because it's like straight. Perhaps our minds are built to experience the sublime. I'm sure a lot of you have felt like the want to just go out, like in the middle of the night, just go out for a walk in the forest because you want to experience the sublime, right? That's a thing that happens with all of us, right?
Yeah, and I think, or even just look at the stars. But this is really interesting. This is kind of post-hippie, as the University of Ohio's article on it might suggest. And what's very interesting is this kind of modern look at the sublime, perhaps without literature. So perhaps looking at across Manhattan or on the Empire State Building, or kind of driving. If none of you can legally drive. Morgan, can you drive?
Legally, yes. Actually, in terms of driving, I'm pretty naff at it.
Okay. So driving at roads at like 2 a.m. in the morning, bank for some, create this moment where the outside experience and your imagination overwhelm you, and you feel connected to kind of an experience of existence that is larger than that. And also, does anyone know the band Sublime? Well, the lead singer of that died of heroin overdose. So if that doesn't link to the final and ultimate kind of manifestation of Sublime in modern day, I don't know what does.
Yeah.
So
I think that's
a good place to end, perhaps.
maybe.
I have thoughts. I think I've exhausted my understanding of the Sublime thoroughly over the course of this hour.
Oh, a quick question. I think in Saigon, when before the Vietnam War, there was a monk who immolated himself whilst he was meditating, and in that meditation he didn't feel a thing, or he appeared to not feel a thing. He suffered the most painful death available to humans, yet he didn't make a single sound, and that was through meditation, and that inspired me to try it myself. And I believe I felt the feeling of the Sublime after a long enough time. So does the Sublime need any external stimuli to be experienced, or by just experiencing nothing, does that bring on the Sublime? So
Jack, are you saying you tried meditating or immolating yourself?
I would hope that I'd never try immolating myself, but I think my point is that is the Sublime really just an experience of our rationality being so overthrown that we essentially get what's that thing in Civilization 5 where or Civ 1 where Gandhi gets so peaceful that it kind of loops back on itself and he gets super aggressive? Is it basically us just experiencing that in the opposite way, where we experience so much we just return to nothing? Would that be the Sublime, or would that be a kind of similar idea to the Sublime?
Yeah, it seems you can be put into this subliminal state, if that's a word, through, actually no, because subliminal means something else. It seems like you can be put into the Sublime state through an overwhelming feeling of any emotion, almost. It appears as though pain, fear, passion, lust, anything of the sort can put you in this Sublime state. I'm not sure how your monk friend, how sublime he felt through immolation, but it seemed to work for him. Not that I'd advise everyone else to try it.
I don't know if it worked for him because he died, obviously, but it did work. It did. It's a very, very famous piece of history, Tom, and it did work in motivating Kennedy to send more troops to Vietnam.
That's something.
Okay, I don't know if it worked or not. Increasing the war for another 10 years, but that's enough history. Shall we say goodbye, perhaps? And we'll see you next week. So it's
Auf Wiedersehen.
Goodbye from me.
Bye.
Okay.
Goodbye.
And thanks for more. Thank you, Morgan.
See you soon.
Thank you.